Good morning and welcome everybody. My name is Miles Hansen. I'm the president and CEO of World Trade Center Utah, and we're excited to welcome you to the first session of the China Paradox Seminar. Over the next few weeks, we'll be talking about geopolitics, Chinese economic policy, and most importantly, what it means for U.S. businesses. And for those not familiar with World Trade Center Utah or not from Utah, we welcome you. And just briefly like to explain who we are here at World Trade Center Utah and what we can do to help your business. So here in the state of Utah, World Trade Center Utah is the leader on international business development. Our sole reason to exist is to help Utah companies grow. We do that a few different ways. We help them increase sales internationally. We work to facilitate international investment here to the state of Utah. And as we're doing that, we're constantly cheerleading and selling Utah internationally as a hub for investment, trade, and innovation. And so if Utah were a product, we got the easiest job in the world to do because Utah is a great product to sell. Here in the state of Utah, we have the nation's best performing economy. We've got one of the lowest unemployment rates here in the country. We have a highly skilled workforce, and we have the most diverse economy in the nation. All this was true before the pandemic, but it's been fascinating to see that thanks to a combination of good leadership and a lot of good fortune, Utah has emerged from the pandemic even stronger than we were going into it. And so I'm excited to see what Utah does in the post-pandemic economy. And so if you're doing business anywhere in the world, please reach out. We'd be happy to connect you with people that can help you learn all the reasons why you should be doing business here in the state of Utah. And we'd love to find ways to help Utah companies participate and facilitate that for you. I'm grateful to our sponsor for the China Paradox Seminar, Harris Bricken, a phenomenal law firm with deep expertise in China. Go check out the China Law Blog. It's a phenomenal resource for insights into what's happening into China. I'd also like to thank and highlight our partners, the Orrin G Foundation, the U.S. China Business Council, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the Deseret News. This is a team effort to bring to you all the very best insights on China and help you understand as a business what you need to do to update your China strategy in the months and years to come. We've got a great lineup today, so let's go ahead and jump into it. Today's program is focused on China's geopolitical ambitions and what it means for the United States. We're going to spend the next 50 minutes having an in-depth discussion with John Huntsman and Matt Pottinger, and I'll be joined by my good friend Boyd Matheson. We'll then take a 10-minute break, and then we'll jump into the second half of today's session, and we'll have a discussion with Marty Gold and several former members of Congress to talk about Congress's role in setting policies that relates to China and get the great insights that these former members of Congress and Marty have to offer. That discussion will be led by the Hatch Center's Matt Sandgren. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce our speakers for today. These are speakers that need no introduction. We've got John Huntsman, former ambassador to Singapore and Russia, and of course China as well. John brings a great perspective to this because he's also a business executive. And he spent many years growing Huntsman Corporation from a little startup here in the Western United States into a global corporation, a global company. And he's also, obviously the former governor of the state of Utah, and he's the chair of World Trade Center Utah. And we're excited to have him involved with the organization and grateful for his legacy of service and all that he has done to represent not just the United States, but Utah around the world. We're also joined with Matt Pottinger. Matt is a former Wall Street Journal reporter, former Marine officer. He launched and grew a business in New York City before joining the Trump administration from day one to lead out on China policy, serving there, longer than just about anybody, all the way up until January 6th of this year. After Matt resigned from the National Security Council, the Washington Post reported about the impact that he has had on the United States on China policy over the past few years. The Washington Post said that it's impossible to overstate the impact Matt has had on national security. He leaves behind a 4-year legacy as impactful as any American strategist before him. And we're all fortunate here in the state of Utah. Matt and his family visited Utah last summer, fell in love with it, ended up buying a house here. And so it's great having Matt living here in Utah, and we're proud to adopt him as the latest newcomer, latest import here to the state of Utah. And also for Boyd Matheson, for those who may not be familiar, Boyd Matheson is the opinion editor of the Deseret News. He's the host of Inside Sources on KSL News Radio. Previously, he was Senator Mike Lee's chief of staff and ran the Sutherland Institute, which is a phenomenal think tank located here in Utah. He's one of Utah's great thought leaders. Boyd, I always refer to you as the Arthur Brooks of Utah. because you have such a great perspective on things, understand how to think through analytically, but also very pragmatically about issues affecting our country and the rest of the world and what it means. And so thank you, John, Matt, and Boyd, for being with us today. Here, just to kick things off, all of us have spent a lot of time either serving in the military, Matt, or working very closely with people in the military. And so we're familiar with the concept of the BLUF, BLUF, bottom line up front. And so to kick off the discussion, John, if it's okay, I'll go to you first. What's your BLUF for today? What are the top 2 or 3 takeaways that you hope businesses tuning in today will learn from today's discussion?
Well, let me give you just a couple of them, Miles, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And great thanks to Matt Pottinger for joining as well, someone for whom I have great respect. When he was writing for the Wall Street Journal, I ran away from him in Beijing when he was gone. Then I joined him later on issues while he was at the NSC, and he is truly an extraordinary public servant, and to Boyd Matheson as well, and all those who have brought this about. So a BLUF, it's nice to start with a good acronym, because those from the NSC live in a world of acronyms, and that's a good way to kind of frame things at the beginning. So let me just offer a couple of thoughts just at the outset. So I was just ruminating about my first exposure to China when I visited 40 years ago as part of President Ronald Reagan's staff when he visited in the early 1980s. I'd lived in Taiwan before that, so I had a sense of the region, but I had not been to China before the early 1980s. We had no trade, we had no interaction people to people. Tensions were high. We'd come out of the Vietnam War, the Cultural Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. And I look at what has happened since then, and to call it the China paradox, Miles, I think is absolutely correct, because on one hand, there's been a remarkable growth story. On the other hand, China under Xi Jinping has become a revisionist nation state, which creates then our challenge for the rest of the 21st century. But in the intervening years since my first visit, per capita income has risen 25 times in China. Life expectancy has improved by 10 years. Capitalism has flourished for the most part. There's a newfound confidence in the leadership and the people. 1% of the markets were open for direct foreign investment back in those days. Today, about 60% of the marketplace is open. That's just to kind of put things in perspective in terms of some economic data points over the last 40 years. What I would be thinking about if I were in the private sector and I spent a good part of my life in that chair, and what to do about the environment, which has changed rapidly over the last few years. I think first and foremost, be realistic and understand the risk, and make sure that you have a regional hedging strategy that allows you not just to understand the state of play between the United States and China and the rest of the world and China, but as you engage economically, to be prepared for any eventuality, because I'm not sure anyone can write the final chapter on how this relationship is going to play out over the rest of the 21st century. So number one, we're entering a period of what I consider to be a new operating environment among great powers. Neither country is comfortable with this. Neither country has been in this spot before. We haven't seen an environment among great powers in at least 100 years. So unexpected things are going to happen, both out of Beijing and out of Washington. Number two, the private sector is probably likely to have a greater impact on change in China than even the United States government. And I say that because a lot of our values and those around the commercial interaction are highly aspirational. Entrepreneurs and builders in China still value what we bring as trading partners and investment partners. They still yearn for a time when they have rule of law and greater transparency in business practices that more resemble what we're doing in the United States. And I believe that kind of continuing engagement is a net plus for the United States and the rest of the world. Number three, China is not the Soviet Union. And whenever we talk about this Cold War environment, this prism through which we now kind of assess and analyze China, I think we're way off the mark. China today is not the China of Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, or Hu Jintao. It's the China of Xi Jinping, which has gone from a status quo nation to more of a revisionist nation. And therein lies our biggest challenge. The Soviet Union had no economy. We had not much of a trading relationship at all. It was a balance of terror based upon our nuclear capabilities between both countries. China is a much different thing. Number four, the United States has very little leverage in dealing with China these days, at least in ways that won't come back to injure or hurt us even more. And I think it's for this reason that U.S. policymakers are increasingly having a tough time trying to deal with tools that can be used in checking China's power and assertiveness in various parts of the world. Fifth and finally, let me just say that some of the issues between the United States and China are downright irreconcilable. They're not going to be resolved. And I think we just have to get used to a world in which we have irreconcilable differences. People have irreconcilable differences, so do nation states. So I think the way that things will play out and how our future will look is very much going to be a combination of A, confrontation, as we already read about in the headlines of the newspapers, two, competition, because I think there will be a real battle over the advancement and development of technology, because whoever dominates in technology will dominate economically for the rest of the 21st century. And then there will be an element of cooperation. And in that, we have to figure out what the mega challenges are globally, whether that be environmental, whether that be future pandemics, or whether that be a nuclear threat. These are all issues that the United States and China must stand up and work together on as the two leading nation states of the world. So there will be elements of cooperation as well. So as you're thinking through your business plans, I think you need to see the world in which there is confrontation that shouldn't surprise anybody, that there is competition, unlike anything we've seen, and there's also elements of cooperation that will be built into the relationship.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. That gives us a lot to dive into here in a few minutes. Thank you, John. Matt, same question to you. What's your bluff for businesses tuning in today?
Hey, Miles, thanks for having me. It's great to see and hear Ambassador Huntsman, who was just a fabulous colleague, one of the people that provided much needed expertise and weight to the new, at the time, Trump administration. And I thought that was a great presentation. That bottom line up front that Ambassador Huntsman gave, I think it is very much spot on. I wanted to add a bit of context in the way of some recent news, namely the Chinese government just this past Saturday issued its fifth five-year plan, its 14th five-year plan. And I think some of the news reporters only got part of the essence of what was announced right. They sort of missed a couple of other elements. The part that they got right was that China is now pursuing quite explicitly a policy of independence from industrialized countries around the world. In other words, China is explicitly trying to make it so that they do not need to import high-tech goods, value-added goods from the industrialized economies around the world. So it's a self-reliance strategy. The parts that they missed were really the second and third components of that. The second component is that China wants to make sure that its supply chain remains the essential supply chain for the rest of the world. So they want to be independent, not have to rely on us for their high-end inputs, but they want us to be wholly reliant on them for high technology outputs throughout the 21st century. The last part of it, which I thought was kind of stunning, was first explicated in a speech by China's leader Xi Jinping back in April, but that speech was kept secret until the end of October, when they published excerpts of that speech in the leading Communist Party theoretical journal called Qiushi. That showed the reason why China wants this strategy of making the world dependent on China, but China not dependent on the world. It is in order to have coercive leverage in the form of economic leverage in order to pursue political aims around the world. So the terminology that they use is that China needs to have the world dependent on China, both as a large market for raw materials, but also as their main manufacturing base and supply chain for high-end goods and services around the world, is for countermeasures and deterrence. And so that is a bit of jargon, which really means offensive leverage. And so I wanted to leave you with a sort of a cautionary tale about what that really looks like over time. Australia, over the course of many years, has built up a very large trade relationship with China. I can't remember the figure, but I think about a third of Australia's exports go to China. Most of it's commodities, iron ore, beef, barley, wine, which some wouldn't call a commodity, but depending on how good the wine is, I guess. But it's but China in 2020 decided to start restricting the imports of those things in order to punish Australia politically. And the punishment was for 14 slights that Beijing published. And in essence, Beijing was making a list of 14 demands of the Australian government to unwind everything from some of its laws, internal legislation in Australia that's designed to counter espionage and covert influence activities, but also to muzzle the Australian press. China has basically said that they're not going to accept criticism, even within Australia, by the Australian press when that criticism is directed at the regime in Beijing. So they've asked that if they want relations to improve again and trade to continue flowing, they've got to muzzle their free press and do 13 other things that they enumerated. So the fact that this was now institutionalized, this grand strategy has been institutionalized just this past weekend in this 5-year plan, I think is a really major event. And so what that suggests is all the things that Ambassador Huntsman was just talking about: the need to be ready to hedge, the need to ensure that you're not unduly surrendering leverage to your Chinese competitors or to the Chinese regime in exchange for market share. You need to make sure that also your supply chains are redundant enough and resilient enough that if China were to step on the air hose, like it's doing right now for Australia, among other countries, that's not going to destroy your business. So I would just leave you with those cautionary notes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matt, for that. Boyd, I'll go ahead and pass the baton over to you. Why don't you help us break this down and get the discussion going?
Okay, and let's start with Ambassador Huntsman. I love the fact that this is titled the paradox of China, because there are so many things that are challenges, especially to businesses and organizations. So I want to dive down just a little bit deeper, Ambassador Huntsman, on this idea of confrontation, competition, and cooperation. Because I do think that's where we see a lot of the paradox, where the United States obviously needs China as an ally on a number of geopolitical things. For those who are watching and listening today, as it relates to the business side of the equation, balancing that idea of cooperation and opportunity with some of the real challenges in terms of human rights violations, religious liberty suppression, or even intellectual property challenges. What is the proper way for businesses to be approaching that today in that paradox of how do we engage and take advantage of opportunities, and how do we make sure we keep those values and our own intellectual property safe?
Well, our companies in the United States are an extension of our national values and of individual values, and that's a good thing. Obviously, China is going to be concerned about companies that propagate U.S. values or are seen as a front for overt U.S. values, but that isn't something we should shy away from. That's what's made the United States great. That's what's made our economy successful. That's what has made us the envy of the world. And it's what China disdains most about the United States. So you're going to see, and I think some of the great changes over the last decade have really come about in terms of the global order that Xi Jinping is trying to pursue within international organizations like the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and within the United Nations. And new friends that they're trying to create through the Belt Road Initiative, because he would like to turn upside down the Western dominant global order, the way things have been since post-World War II. This is his goal. It has been the goal of the Chinese Communist Party for quite some time, and they have pursued it and implemented it with great precision over decades now. And for those of us, Matt included, who have watched China's growth over a good number of years, I don't think any of us is surprised at where we sit today. China is very big on strategies. We are not in the United States, which is one of our big problems. They stick to their strategies. They learn from the rest of the world in terms of what works and what doesn't. They've been in the classroom of the world for the last 40 years. They've been able to pick and choose those systems of transportation, of governance, of economic development that work best for them, given their values. And that's kind of what they have been pursuing the last little while. But let me make one point to pick up on what Matt said about the 5-year plan. And those of us who have been close to China over the years actually read these 5-year plans. And they tell you something about what's in the minds of the senior policy leaders and where aspirationally they want to go. And it's not surprising that most of these 5-year plans are economics based. I think leadership in China learned some very important lessons by watching the Soviet Union in the days of perestroika and glasnost in the late 1980s and early 1990s. They saw a failed nation state largely because they opened up politically and had no economy to support it all the while. And they pledged at the time to make sure that they kept a tight lid on politics while opening economics very, very aggressively, which is what they have done. So Xi Jinping wakes up every morning, and I think he's obsessed with a few economic indicators. Why? Because he needs a stable nation state. Anything that deteriorates domestic stability in China means the end of China as we know it today. The closest we've come to that would have been the events running up to June of 1989, the Tiananmen Square uprising. Many people thought that was largely the result of the death of beloved party secretary Hu Yaobang. But the economic indicators around the country told a much different story in terms of unemployment and the cost of basic goods. And people were outraged by that, along with creeping corruption. So Xi Jinping, I think, has had a laser-like focus on economic development. He wants to have national winners, getting back to the 5-year plan. China wants to have their own Google, their own Facebook, their own Disney, their own GE, their own Ford Motor Company. They want to be able to compete based upon their terms. And where that goes from here, I think is really going to be the interesting question. So when you look at the elements of power that any successful nation state, at least in the last 500 years, has been able to seize, whether it's education, innovation and technology, competitiveness in global markets, share of world trade, economic output, military. The two things that China really has not been able to capture are, one, financial markets, where they still lag, and number two is a reserve currency, where they still lag. So to my mind, part of, or just beyond the 5-year plan that we've touched upon just a little bit, I think China's obsession largely in the years to come is going to try to figure out how to internationalize their currency, the renminbi. So if I were in business, I would try to be astute to what this means. Capital markets, more and more, are going to have to deal with the renminbi. Lending and transactions, I think, are going to be more and more in the renminbi. And the United States is going to have to determine for itself if it is in our national interest, economic and strategic interest, to hold on to the world's reserve currency. Because today you've got about 2% of global reserves and lending that are done in renminbi and about 60% in the US dollar. That's how deep a hole it is for the Chinese right now in terms of their control of the financial markets. And I think this is going to be a major priority for Chinese leadership going forward.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ambassador. Matt, let's jump over to you and on a similar vein in terms of this balance point, especially as you've had a front row seat there in terms of balancing that human rights component. We know there's been a lot of chatter. We've got a number of questions coming in. I can see in our text line there that people are asking about the Winter Olympics and some calls for boycotts there. What do you see as the balance point in terms of calling out those things that matter to us, that are critical to us as business leaders, and things that we need to engage with China on?
Well, I agree with Ambassador Huntsman that is our greatest strength, right? It's our values, it's our system. We don't have the ability to run a centralized system, which when you have just the right conditions, that can work pretty well for a while. China's done pretty well for the last 30 years, starting from a very low baseline. But if you zoom out the telescope even a little bit further and look at the 70 plus years, 71 years that the People's Republic of China has been in power, their centralized system led them into a pretty deep ditch, really into a canyon in the early decades, the first half really of the People's Republic of China, when you had upwards of 50 million people dying from inept policy making, people dying from starvation and also from political purges and so forth. So our system, we're not going to be able to be as disciplined in having our own 5-year plans and so forth. It's the nature of our system. But over time, what we have is our freedom and the ability to have a government that gets out of the way of its people, that gets out of the way of its enterprises. And the people tend to do a lot better than their governments at figuring out where to take the economy and where to put their resources and their sweat. I think that the Ambassador Huntsman made a point, which is exactly right. China is not the Soviet Union. This isn't a Cold War, but there is an ideological dimension that we can no longer ignore, and that I wanted to point out. President Biden just maybe 2 weeks ago put out what he called his interim strategic guidance, and so it's a 24-page document. And one of the things that struck me about that document was the degree to which it dwells on really the ideological component of our competition with China. And his documents clearly state that China is the top challenge for the 21st century for the United States and for our way of life. So when in his introductory letter, President Biden said, there are people who are losing faith in democracy and who think that autocracy is the way forward. And we're facing this critical moment that's really going to decide whether the world is going to run on autocratic software, if you will, or remain predominantly democratic. And so he dwells on this theme throughout his interim guidance. If you read the speeches like Ambassador Huntsman and I, have had to do from our various jobs, him as ambassador to China and me in my White House roles, we do read what the Chinese leaders are saying in their own language to their own people. And Xi Jinping has made clear, going all the way back to early 2013, that this is very much an ideological struggle against the United States and against Western democracy. He's made clear that in his terms, it is a zero-sum sort of competition or contest. He talks about how communism, Marx and Engels were right, that the inherent contradictions in capitalist systems still are there, and ultimately capitalism will die out, and China's going to lead the effort to ensure that capitalism dies. Though I'm quoting, right, barely paraphrasing some of the phrases that Xi Jinping used in that seminal speech back in 2013. So what does that mean for U.S. CEOs and businesses, right? What it means is that ideological component is inescapable. As much as we would like to wish that it were not. It also means that you're going to have a harder time pleasing both Washington, D.C. and Beijing at the same time, because both capitals are putting greater and greater demands on you to follow their system. And President Biden said in his guidance, we're not going to allow American companies to do business if it comes at the expense of their values in China. And the Chinese are saying very loudly, with increasing frequency, forget your values. If you want to do business in China, don't even send a tweet in your own country mentioning Hong Kong or Taiwan or Tibet or the genocide that's taking place against ethnic and religious minorities inside China's borders. You're not even allowed to talk about those things at home in the United States if you want to do business in China. So both of these capitals are putting greater and greater demands on CEOs, and you're all like sailors trying to straddle two boats. And you know what happens when a sailor tries to straddle two boats? You usually end up getting wet or worse. So I think that it's really important for CEOs to start doing an extremely rigorous risk assessment on both sides of the Pacific for their businesses, understanding better how much the landscape has changed. There are significant fiduciary risks that have been introduced, reputational risks, particularly associated with what's happened in Hong Kong and the genocide in Xinjiang, regulatory risks in both capitals, and even personal security risks. We've seen a couple of Canadian businessmen get taken hostage to be used as collateral in Beijing's negotiations with the Canadian government. So you're in a minefield now, and you need to really carefully draw a map of where all these mines are right now as you proceed, to do more business within China.
All right, thanks, Matt. Ambassador Huntsman, I'm going to ask you kind of a two-part question. I'm really intrigued. You said in your first response there that China is really good at strategy, and we are not in the United States. And so I want you to respond to a little bit of what Matt has just shared in terms of what you agree, what you disagree with in terms of those points. But then also just looking at it in what should we be doing strategically? Why is it that we're not so good at strategy? And then what should our strategy be, especially as business leaders?
Well, we have core values as a nation, and they extend to our foreign policy. They extend to our economic engagement, our humanitarian policies, people to people as well. And we should never back down from our traditional values. The Chinese are looking for us to do that, and that will be a display of weakness. And moreover, we will cease to become the guiding light in the world that many are looking to. When you look at China, it's a large country geographically, 1.3 plus billion people. The Communist Party of China is just over 80 million strong, spread out in about 4,000 different outposts around the country. We forget when we look at the country that still leaves us with over 1.3 billion people, 70% of whom live in the rural areas without access to adequate health care, where the economy is changing very quickly under their feet. Farmers are being displaced. They have hundreds of millions of farmers who are out of work and essentially having to leave the countryside to go into the cities. So China is a much different, larger and more complex situation than the simple sound bites of today kind of describe it as being. But let me get into, because we talked a bit about values as it relates to business. And I think China is dead set on becoming a technology leader as we move into the future, whether it's 5 or 6G, whether it's automated payments, whether it's the future of semiconductors, whether it's biotech or fintech. And we as a country are going to have to go into overdrive in terms of making sure that we are competitive and dominate in certain of these industries. Now, here's the paradox that I think is an interesting one. Now, I'm not sure that China's economic development, at least in the technology realm, can go as far as they would like it to go in a closed society. So right now, as Matt rightly pointed out, there is an ideological struggle that I think is going to continue for some time between authoritarianism and democracy. And Xi Jinping looks out at the world and sees that about a third of the nation states of the world are practicing democracy, which is probably, at least in recent history, a low point. And he sees a real opening for himself. To those who are advancing technology in the real world, a closed society that does not have an open internet, access to the kind of capital and ideas, the attraction of talent that you need to create a Silicon Valley, an Ann Arbor, Michigan, an Austin, Texas, a Boston, Massachusetts, a Silicon Slopes, Utah. I think you reach a point where you're no longer able to advance beyond simply what the state can provide for you. Now, there are 150,000 state-owned enterprises in China, some of which are relatively competitive. Some are the largest market cap companies in the entire world. Others are dogs. They don't perform. They have too many employees. They're payoffs for a lot of municipal friends and family members who were part of the Communist Party elite. They're going to have a reckoning of sorts in their own economic development plans as they continue to transition from the old style to the new. The problem being that the new style of economic development is going to require them to be much more open to the world, to have open access to information, an open internet, sourcing and procurement and supply lines that are a little more global than those they've been accustomed to. And that's why, exactly getting back to Matt's point, one of China's goals is to secure their supply chains, whether it's out of South America, Africa, South Asia, and then to have a military that they can deploy in support of those supply lines. They want to make sure that the mothership, China, is always a successfully functioning economy. Getting back to what we mentioned earlier, if the economy fails, so does everything else. So the entire foreign policy and their strategic outlook to the world is very much based on their economic vibrancy and well-being. But I think we're up against a real challenge, at least on the technology side, because you can only go so far in acquiring talent and accessing the kind of information you need in a closed society. And that's where our traditional Western values and what China is trying to do are going to collide, and where we have an opportunity to pick up our pace as it relates to STEM funding for primary education, our basic research and development budgets. If you look where China is placing its bets on research and development, they are going long on AI. They're going long in certain other aspects of technological development, and they're beating us right now in some of them. I think there's a ceiling there, and we would be foolhardy as a nation if we did not have a strategy that spoke to competitiveness, because nobody does it better than the United States, and competition is good. And instead of complaining about the China threat, I say this is an opportunity for us to roll up our sleeves and to become even more competitive, every one of the 50 states to become more competitive in making the United States able to compete through the rest of the 21st century.
You know, John, through all of our conversations about China, one thing that always strikes me is your confidence. And I think that's important because you've got the expertise and the perspective where you can look backwards beyond the horizon at how we arrived to this point. And you also think very strategically on what's beyond the horizon and not forgetting the fact that we should have great confidence in the superiority of our system, our economy, and our ability to go out there and compete and win against anybody out there in the world if we get it right here at home and lead into that confidence and set the right policies here. You know, today we're talking a lot about this competition. John, you recently wrote in the Deseret News that the single greatest challenge facing the United States this century is the rise of an emboldened China with the elements of power to shape a world that is antithetical to American values. We've talked today about how China wants to turn upside down the Western-dominated rules-based economic order. And so we see that we're in this competition. Matt, I'd be curious for your take. Is we see ourselves as competition. I appreciate you bringing up this ideological component. I guess we're in competition for hearts and minds, if we can use that phrase, around the world for people to continue to buy into the superiority of our system and to raise people up and generate prosperity around the world, just as it has done in China over the past few decades. But man, as we think about the U.S. perspective, of course, there's hard power and there's soft power. So I guess a two-part question. From a hard power perspective, what types of things should the United States be doing in this competition from China? And then from a soft power perspective, as companies are engaging, as universities are engaging, as individuals are, what are the types of things that we should think about from a national perspective about how these people-to-people ties can be used to protect and advance our interests in China?
Thanks, Miles. I think that in any step that we take as a country, or even as an individual state, one of the 50 states within the country, and also as an alliance. So, but one thing that China does not have are allies. Okay, North Korea makes a pretty lousy ally for China, and that's the closest thing they've got. The United States, we've got our NATO alliance with the entirety of Europe. We have mutual defense treaties with 5 countries in Asia, including Japan, South Korea, and Australia, not to mention the Philippines and Thailand. We've got very good partnerships that are growing closer together with major countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia, Singapore, where Ambassador Huntsman was, and partly thanks to his efforts, is virtually an ally of the United States. So as we look at what we want to do together as allies, as well as a government, whether it's new legislation or initiatives, new policies, or even public-private partnerships, we should always be looking through the lens of, is this going to acquire greater leverage on our side on behalf of industrialized democracies, countries that have accountable government and the rule of law? Or is it going to surrender? Are those steps going to surrender leverage to the dictatorship in Beijing, which has really graduated from authoritarianism? Unfortunately, it pains me to say this. I spent almost 9 years of my life in China. It has really graduated from authoritarianism to a totalitarian vision under the current leadership. So we don't want to surrender more leverage to that kind of a system. So in every action that we as businessmen and policymakers make, we want to ensure that we are not surrendering leverage, even as we continue to engage to try to cooperate in those instances where Beijing actually has a common interest and is willing to cooperate with us. So I guess that's one way of thinking about it. In terms of soft power, it's another area where we have an advantage that Beijing simply does not, by virtue of the system that they're running. There's a massive focus in China on controlling the population. If you just looked at China's budget and its personnel policies, you'd almost begin to think that China views its own people as a bigger threat than it views the United States and external competitors. It spends more money now on internal surveillance than it spends on its military, and it spends a lot on its military. It spends more than the rest of Asia combined. So soft power is something that we're going to maintain an advantage in, so long as we don't squander it or screw up ourselves here at home. We've got to keep the flame of democracy bright and hot here at home, and to live by those core convictions and core values that the ambassador was just talking about.
That's great. Thank you, Matt. And John, back over to you. So I'm actually, by the way, we're getting a lot of great questions coming in. So thank you for everyone for submitting those. I'm trying to steer the conversation. I think we're picking up and touching on a lot of these different questions coming in. But one in particular caught my eye. This is what it says. Ambassador, I'd be curious to get your take on this question, but then also within this context of soft power, because I think that's incredibly powerful. Sometimes the discourse here in the United States around China sometimes becomes black and white. And it seems like people frame it up as either believing in a very laissez-faire approach to China, go sell things and don't think about leverage in this competition, or people try to portray those that are concerned about China as being, overly hardliners, hawks, people who want to completely sever and decouple everything. In my mind, severing and decoupling, that takes off the field, the soft power that we have through the variety of people-to-people ties that exist between the United States and China. And so this question, I think, sums it up really well. So this person wrote, "Please keep my identity anonymous," which I think speaks to some of this leverage that we've heard about. "The conflict for companies is that if a company stands up for Western values or confronts China on some of its practices, you run the very real risk that China suffocates you. Look even at Jack Ma and Ren Zhiqiang. What can or should U.S. companies do to promote Western values within China?" So, John, what advice would you have?
Well, I don't know if we're talking about Western values or universal values, but we talk about soft power, and soft power is very much an emanation or an extension of a free people. You can't have soft power without a free society. And that's why China fears our soft power, because in every instance, and it's an extrapolation of people working in a free society and pursuing their dreams and ambitions. So the folks who are really widely admired by the citizens of China here in the United States are not our politicians necessarily. They're technology developers, they're athletes, they're musicians, they're writers, they're poets. They're all people who are associated with civil society and freedom. So we don't generally, and Matt knows this, we don't make soft power an overt part of our foreign policy generally. We deal in a world of hard power. But soft power is just a natural extension of who we are as a people. And we should always do whatever we can to nurture and ensure that it flourishes, because it has touched countless people in numerous countries around the world based on the kind of example we have put on display, even though we might be imperfect practitioners of much of what we preach. China, for the first time in the hard power category, is venturing out. Matt mentioned the dearth of allies that China has, and it's true. It's been North Korea, Pakistan, and Iran mostly, and who wants those three as your allies? And I think they know that there's a ceiling there. They've never ventured much beyond the territory that they've claimed to be their own, some of which, of course, is in dispute. When you look at the South China Sea, Taiwan, East China Sea, it used to be the Mongolian People's Republic, Xinjiang and Tibet, Macau and Hong Kong. And you can see where some of that territory has been recovered, and China has made it a top foreign policy priority to make sure that all of those so-called lost territories are recovered, and much of their foreign policy and security policy will be based around some of those challenges going forward. But I think it's important to note that for the first time in China's history, at least since Admiral Zheng He set out with his flotilla several hundred years ago, that China is now venturing into the world. They're not practiced at it. They don't know how it works. They've never really used hard power the way, in a sense, that the United States and other world leaders have. They're blazing a trail called the Belt Road Initiative. One goes north, the other goes south. They're covering 60% of the world's population and 40% of the world's GDP. It's both a geo-economic exercise and a geopolitical exercise, make no mistake about it. They're buying friends, they're getting people indebted all the while. It is going to be very interesting to see what kind of backlash emerges between China and its newfound friend, Russia, when the Belt Road Initiative begins to get more active in Central Asia, for example, which Russia has seen as its traditional area of influence. But I'm not so sure that this exercise in hard power, largely economics and investment, is going to yield the kind of dividends that China is hoping for. I say that because I sense there could be a backlash emerging. There needs to be a parallel effort, different guiding philosophies, different values, different governance systems that are put on display for the weaker countries of the world to be able to look at and analyze. I think China is making the assessment that the world is weak today, that they can buy off a lot of those weak nation states with corrupt leadership. And I think that's a big part of what they're doing. So we need to continue our hard power efforts. The freedom of navigation exercises that we do in the South China Sea and throughout the Western Pacific that China hates are integral to the free flow of trade and commerce for all nations of the world. Our advocacy of human rights is something that still represents an aspiration for people, yes, even in China and all over the world, to embrace those kinds of policies. And soft power is something that I think we should utilize. And I think we ought to be even a little more strategic and thoughtful about how we deploy our soft power as a nation. I think increasingly that will be one of our more attractive features.
Matt, let me go over to you. Obviously, navigating all of these paradoxes is challenging at best. Requires many of the business folks that are on this Zoom call today to be quick to observe, to orient to what's going on, to make decisions and act, and to keep that cycle going swiftly. We've had a number of questions pop up in the chat regarding the small business owners who are very dependent on some of those imports from China or those relationships. What kind of perspective or what kind of strategies do you think they should be thinking about as they deal with, again, how do we navigate a lot of these paradoxes?
Yeah, I think following on from the last question, just sort of about how do we amplify our values? I think the first and most important step is simply not to give up our values at home in the hope that it will win us some kind of favor from Beijing. That kind of favor comes and it's fleeting. It usually doesn't end well ultimately in any place. I think Hollywood's a great example of that, where the movie studios in Hollywood bent over backwards to try to accommodate Chinese censorship standards. I mean, to an almost comedic degree, you would see screenwriters, editing out scenes and characters and adding stuff to try to kiss up to the propaganda ministry in Beijing. Well, if you look at Hollywood today, it's seen a declining share of the Chinese box office, even as Chinese movie going increases in overall size. The Chinese film studios, which report directly to the authorities there, have learned all the tricks of the trade, at least in terms of the technology and the basics of stringing together a story from Hollywood, and now are crowding all the Hollywood studios out. It's gotten much harder for Hollywood to make money in China. I'm hopeful that the realization of that eventually leads to more morally courageous films again out of Hollywood. So don't demote your own values, in the pursuit of market share. It's not going to end well in the medium term for you anyway. For small businesses, it's a great question, because I think there's a need right now there's a great opportunity for businesses, logistics firms and supply chain management firms to step in to help American businesses to sort of lead the way in doing the hard work of forging those new supply chain manufacturing bases, whether it's in Vietnam, Indonesia, Mexico, things coming back here to home in the United States, or helping India get its act together as it's gradually doing in terms of regulation to try to bring more manufacturing there. But I think that, again, the idea of hedging is absolutely essential. You do not want, it's really an aberration in history that the world would have concentrated so much of its manufacturing onto the East Coast of an authoritarian country, the way that we've done for 3 decades or so in China. It's an aberration and it's unsustainable. And already you're seeing foreign direct investment beginning to peel off into other markets. You're seeing the Japanese government actually subsidizing the cost of moving Japanese factories out of China and to shift them to places like Vietnam, or even to bring them home to Japan. So it's a very fluid, these tectonic plates are shifting right now, and small businesses have got to get educated. It's not going to be as easy as it was, where you just rely on tons of stuff being imported from China, given the risk that China might start squeezing that supply, just like they're doing to the Australians, just like they did to a lot of countries during the COVID, the height of the pandemic, when China would withhold protective gear until countries had done things that the Chinese had asked them to do in sort of a political vein.
Thank you. Ambassador Huntsman, I want to go back to something you alluded to earlier. You mentioned that the vast majority of the Chinese citizens are not members of the party, the political party, and maybe you can help us from your experience over there to just give us some kind of a societal view of this. What's the average Chinese citizen's view of the government's actions, human rights, and so on? I think it's easy for us here to kind of think it's all just one monolithic, everybody is in command and control. But from your time there, from your experience there, from your time out amongst the people, both in the cities and out in the countrysides, what does that really look like? Give us some sense of that. Help us understand that a little better.
Almost 1.4 billion people, over 50 separate minority groups in different corners of the country. It's a beautiful tapestry. Like Matt, I've been to every corner of the country, virtually every province. Restricted areas like Tibet, which took me 1.5 years to get permission to travel to. I've been out to Xinjiang, to Urumqi, Kashgar, right along the Afghan border. And what you find is you find real pockets of dissent toward Beijing. The farther out from Beijing you get, Beijing and the policymakers within the party become irrelevant. So what is interesting, I would typically make it a habit went in the outlying areas to meet with people who were in trouble with their government, number one. Some of them refused to meet with me for obvious reasons. And then I would meet with young entrepreneurs just to get a sense of what was on their mind and where they were going. And it was amazing how kind of disconnected the entrepreneurial class was and is from Beijing. The amount of money they're bringing in is 10, 20 times what was the case a decade ago. They're raising money from Japan, they're raising money from the United States, from Korea. They dress like Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. They speak in their own hip kind of language, and they are really kind of a distinct subset. I remember going to speak at Jack Ma's customer conference in Hangzhou. Jack Ma asked if I would go speak to about 3,000 of his customers. And it was interesting because they were all seated in the Hangzhou Communist Party arena. And I got up and instead of, workers of the world unite, in Chinese, I said, entrepreneurs of the world unite. And it went, yeah, and I thought, this is, again, part of the great dichotomy that exists within China. And then on the other hand, you have to realize that there's really no free press. So the information that people receive, they can't access the internet unless they're pretty sophisticated. My daughters were pretty sophisticated. They could jump over the Great Wall without any trouble at all through VPN technology. But the government increasingly is feeding the population a lot of anti-American rhetoric. And you have to remember there's already an innate sense among the population, even those who really do like and want to like the United States, the age-old debate between Jeffersonian freedom and Confucianism and the role of the individual in society. There's always a debate that is going on, and I was part of some of these debates in little pop-up corners of Beijing where people would want to debate the value systems between both countries about Confucianism, where the role of the individual is virtually to support the family or the collective, versus our Jeffersonian freedoms, where the individual is accorded awesome autonomy and individuality and freedom. Most people in China simply can't get their heads around that. But I'll end with this because I think by and large, and I used to do the taxi cab quiz as a Chinese speaker where I could get into a taxi cab, not when I was ambassador, they didn't allow me to do it then, but just during other random visits and just to talk to the average taxi driver about their views of Xi Jinping, their views of the Communist Party elite. And here's what they will tell you. They know there's corruption going on and they hate it. And I think that's one reason that Xi Jinping, just almost 10 years ago after the 18th Party Congress, undertook this very aggressive anti-corruption drive because corruption was the rot within the party that was killing the country. And I think Xi Jinping saw this as something that would destroy them ultimately if he didn't get a handle on it. They know that's going on, but what they like and what they appreciate, particularly in Xi Jinping, and this is just sort of an unscientific survey that I do all the time when I visit there, they like the economic uplift, the economic development. They feel that their lives have been enhanced, and that's thanks to China's leadership. And they wonder why the United States is doing some of the things it's doing, why we fly reconnaissance missions off their front porch, why we are aggressively in pursuit of their naval assets in the Western Pacific. And we do all of this for reasons that we've kind of alluded to earlier as part of our extension of hard power and our national security interests. So it's also a situation where people-to-people engagement, I think longer term is going to be one of the most important things that we do between the United States and China. And right now we have 350,000 Chinese students. I don't know what the future of these programs is going to be studying in our universities. I have yet to meet a citizen of China who has been exposed to the U.S. educational system at the higher level, who didn't have their lives completely changed and transformed by what they learned, what they saw, and what they felt about the United States. It's one of our greatest deliverables. So there's a lot more to come, and obviously the years ahead, certainly the next decade is going to be probably the most important in the recent history of U.S.-China relations.
Thank you very much for that perspective. I can't believe that we're out of time. This has been a phenomenal discussion. Thank you very much to everybody for your active participation. We've had some great questions. We've covered many of them, but we haven't had a chance to dig into all of them. It just shows how important this topic is. And the good news is this is the first session, but we've got 4 more coming up today and then over the next few weeks. Boyd, I know you've got to go live on air 2 minutes ago. Boyd's show's Inside Sources starts off at 11 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. So Boyd's going to leave us and jump straight into, probably hundreds of thousands of listeners across the Western United States on radio and then across the country online as well. We'll go ahead and wrap things up. But John, Matt, thank you so much for spending time with us. Thank you for your perspectives. It's been absolutely phenomenal. And we appreciate your leadership over many years to help represent the United States internationally, as well as to help think through the right policies and strategies to help protect and advance U.S. interests. China is a difficult topic, and it takes a great deal of expertise to handle it and manage it the way that the two of you have done. So thank you for being with us today. For all of our participants, we'll have a 10-minute break now, intermission. We're going to keep the Zoom live and active. You'll see some slides going as we all run to the bathroom, fill up our coffee or water, whatever we're drinking. And then we'll reconvene for a roundtable discussion led by Matt Sandgren from the Hatch Center. We'll have Marty Gold, former Senator Mary Landrieu from Louisiana, former Representative Charles Boustany from Louisiana, former Rep. Howard Berman from California, having a digging into these issues and going a little bit deeper. And so we'll continue to see these questions that you've submitted and try to catch some of those in the second session. And then also a reminder for anybody who can't stay with us today, next week, same time, same place, Wednesday, March 24th at 10 a.m., we'll have a phenomenal discussion digging in a little bit deeper into China's economic and trade policy and what it means for U.S. businesses. So thank you again, Matt and John, for being with us today. And everybody, let's hold tight, but we'll reconvene here in about 10 minutes.